Hello and welcome to the G3 Pulse podcast. So as legislation in North American states makes the multi-factor authentication or MFA mandatory on gaming platforms, we've taken the excellent opportunity to sit down with Rob Griffin, the CEO of MIRACL, who will share some useful tips and insights about how multi-factor authentication can be integrated smoothly with minimum impact to customer experience and bets. So Rob, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Could you begin by telling me more about MIRACL and the company's interaction with the gaming and gambling industry thus far?
Sure, happily. So really, I guess our involvement with the gaming and gambling industry goes back to what now, 18 months, because we've essentially been providing a password authentication solution for a lottery operator that we started back 18 months ago. And since that time, we've had the kind of good fortune to post some pretty extraordinary results in terms of their organic month-to-month growth, which has literally accelerated 30% month to month. So fantastic user growth. We've worked considerably in reducing the friction around their registration process as well, in terms of striking out some of the fields that have to fill out when they come on board. And overall, it's just been a fantastic test case for how our solution can offer a superb user experience in the login, as well as all of the security and privacy that MIRACL promises in multi-factor authentication. Most importantly, we've had kind of no account takeovers in that time, and that's coming off a history of them previously having quite a few. So they've also had a kind of commensurate drop in the support cost. But in regards to the recent spate of changes of legislation, there have obviously been quite a few complexities introduced as a result of the sort of New Jersey and Ontario legislation, and as we can see, a number of states following quite rapidly. And so there's been a process where we've been in consultation, really, both with the regulator, first of all, in getting our solution approved as a MFA provider, which it now is, and also in just having stand the ways in which they can essentially rely on the user's accessing device, specifically the kind of biometric there. I think that's been a real challenge for operators, because frankly, they were expecting to be able to just basically use the metric on the device and enable users to just have one additional factor on top of that. That's not been allowed by New Jersey, for good reason. There are many devices out there that frankly don't have a reliable biometric. So there's been a good amount of kind of interaction with that, and then that's really culminated in a series of pilots that we're now initiating, both with some multi-state operators, very excited to announce those shortly, and single state operators in both US and Canada. So yeah, very exciting times for us.
So before we delve into the intricacies of MFA and also the legislation that's being approved and the potential ramifications of that globally, what exactly is multi-factor authentication, and what are the basic forms of authentication and verification?
Sure. So so the first point I would say is, with regard to multi-factor authentication, obviously we all talk about MFA. What does that mean? Well, there are really three bases upon which you can authenticate a user. The first is something that they have inherent to them. So that might be a biometric or some form of behavior. The second is something that they have in their possession. So that could be a dongle or some particular piece of hardware or their device potentially. And the third would be a knowledge-based factor. And the importance there is to ensure that it is a true secret and not just something that exists, you know, in a database somewhere that a hacker could easily have, you know, compromised, and therefore, you know, is just actually something that can be conveyed or relayed by a bot, you know, for an account. So it's really those three, you know, headline choices that you've got in order to provide a multi-factor authentication. Clearly, we separate the task between authentication and ID verification as being, you know, quite distinct. Identity verification is essentially in the account registration process, where you're essentially carrying out a, you know your client proof of identity. And then at that juncture, once you've established a point of trust with the operator, it's thereafter incumbent on them to authenticate you as being, you know, that person that originally entered that trusted relationship each time you log in and seek to access your account. And it's just, you know, crucial to understand that there are that they're different tasks, but they sort of interact in the sense that, you know, if you can cut down the required number of fields in the authentication process, that can have ramifications for reducing the friction in the registration process. And in, you know, both of these instances, it's just really important to just optimize, you know, both the user experience and the security and integrity of the data that you're using to reach, you know, that state of trust, both in the verification and in the authentication.
And would you say that the gaming industry, so far as your experience goes within this field, their current understanding and knowledge of multi-factor authentication is lacking in some regards, perhaps compared to other industries?
Well, you know, I don't want to come across as the critic at all. It's just hardly surprising that you know, MFA has probably got a penetration rate right now of say, prior to the recent legislation, something in the region of like 3-4% of total gaming users. So you know, these are early days, right? And therefore, people, when I say people, operators probably haven't got the experience of understanding what is a comparatively, you know, complex arena, because it has so many ramifications on the user experience and on the kind of total, if you like, opportunity for security with you know, a friction-free gaming entertainment. So yeah, I do think there is a good amount of learning to be had, and I would put absolutely at the top of that user experience. But you know, there's also a lot of other issues. So you know, how do you prevent account takeover? I would say that historically, a lot of the solutions haven't really been that effective. There's no question that the single best way to reduce account takeover is through MFA. It's not foolproof. Different types of MFA will provide, you know, different levels of protection. But you know, yeah, account takeover would be a big one. Then I think within MFA, there are a set of kind of good practice guidelines. So the idea that you actually got to try and tie the device to the user, and therefore try and triangulate, you know, device, user, and app. That's really important if you're trying to get to responsible gaming. And you know, we'll no doubt talk more about that. But it feels to me as if, yeah, there's a wider issue of actually, is this enabling you to better understand the devices that a given user has authorized for their account? And then what are the other issues? I guess there's some sort of fairly complex cybersecurity issues around phishing. So most MFA, probably 90% of MFA out there right now is not phishing resistant. Phishing is probably the single biggest vector of attack, certainly fastest. So the reality is that, you know, a very important consideration. And then I think the last point would be that MFA actually enables you to set up a relationship with a user's identity and their device that can then be used to essentially reduce the instance of fraud thereafter, or potential dispute. So you can have a user, sign for a given action, sign for a download, sign for a given bet, and then tie their actions to a given set of terms and conditions. And that can be really important in things like self-exclusion, because you've had an awful lot of people say, hey, my bet didn't come in, but actually I didn't want to place that bet. I was wanting to self-exclude. Well, what do you do at that point? You've got to, then enter you didn't tell us, and they'll say, oh well, I tried to, and I couldn't get through, or all the rest of it. And actually, this technology enables operators to really get clarity in the user flow, so that people commit to, yes, I carried out this bet on this device at this time. I registered that I wasn't self-excluding, and thereafter there's a really speedy and irrefutable basis of transacting with your customer.
And what steps do you think the gaming industry can take as a collective to embrace multi-factor authentication? We're going to touch on legislation shortly, but it's clearly a growing trend, if you will. So how can operators and potentially suppliers look to get ahead of that?
Well, I mean, this might come across as slightly odd, but my view is that gaming and gambling is in the unique position of being highly regulated and yet an entertainment.
Yes.
And if you look at the finance sector, users are far more tolerant of a kind of Fort Knox experience to get to their account. Like sort of Gringotts Bank in Harry Potter. It's part of the ceremony that you have to go through this whole elaborate fiasco to get to your account, where everything's under lock and key. And the reality is that doesn't game. People want fun. They're there for entertainment. And so my own view is that operators really need to focus on user experience first and foremost, because without that, they're going to bring about quite a lot of resentment in their underlying user. And I feel that that is just the lifeblood. The being entertained is the lifeblood of the business, and it really is a kind of systemic threat to gaming if that is in any way compromised. So I would say that people need to think about legislation as an opportunity for them to actually overhaul their whole user registration and user authentication flow and the tools that they use, so as to bring about the minimum in friction, and frankly, the maximum in just optimized user experience.
Well, let's touch on that legislation. Last April, Ontario became the first North American country to legalize online betting, and also, more crucially for this conversation, the first North American gaming regulator to insist on the use of multi-factor authentication. So what does that mean? With Pennsylvania in December, New Jersey prior, they've followed suit. What are the specifics of the legislation that have been imposed thus far? Are they absolutely mandatory in all three of those provinces? And why now?
Well, two parts to that question. So the short answer is that, yeah, they've made MFA mandatory. And I think that you should consider those three states as the first of many. And if you indeed talk to operators in, other states, they are, fully primed that whether it's, Ohio or Colorado or gosh, we were talking about so many of late, but yeah, there are just a whole, at least say 7 states that have publicly stated that they're like to follow the line of New Jersey. Oh. And so I think, yeah, this is the clear direction of the tide. There are quite a few sort of nuances to the legislation that mean that, for example, you can't rely on a biometric for long. So if a user logs in and then returns 3 days later, you are not able to essentially just say, okay, well, we can use Face ID to bring them back in. And for an Apple user, has become the sort of de facto standard. That's not acceptable, largely, as I say, because there are so many devices out there, even if there's only, say, 5–10% of the user base that don't have a reliable biometric. So that really does reduce the number of options and demand that there is a full MFA in a very high proportion, let's just say a very high proportion of the total number of logins. And so when designing the user flow, you've really got to think about that quite carefully. And this is an exercise for operators that's going to take months, and therefore they've probably got to think that in that time, states such as, I don't know, like Puerto Rico has a particular rule on the use of MFA when you change your personal identifiable information as a operator. Indiana has particular rules around privacy, and it's anticipated that Virginia will too. So it's basically required to pretty much build a framework of how all of these states interact and figure out which ones obviously are applicable to your operation, and therefore what you need to do. And certainly we're teed up to that task. But what I would say as an overall kind of headline is really you need a tool set with some flexibility to enable you to do that, and not just a kind of rubber stamp MFA, because it's going to be a different process and a different requirement in different states, and that's going to evolve over time. So you want something that allows you with some flexibility.
It's interesting that when you speak to, whether you're speaking to a service provider such as yourself, or whether you're talking to a machine supplier into a land-based casino, or a sports betting operator, it doesn't matter who you're chatting to. If you're talking about the US, it's always, can we please have more collaboration amongst regulators? But that's just the way it's going to be, I think, for the time being, as these states slowly roll out. But on that rollout, how quickly could this potentially roll out? You mentioned several states there. Are you talking a few of them making MFA mandatory this year?
So I would say, short answer to your question is yes. I think that this is probably a 12 and 24 month kind of timetable. And, obviously that is also knocking on the door of some pretty big headline events, such as, what happens with California, right? I mean, that's the big elephant in the room. So, yeah, this is going to be an ongoing process. And I would say this, that, it is just that, a process, not an event. Because if you look at why this is all happening, on the one side, and I mean, you asked why now, I think there's the obvious point that, states want to protect their users from the kind of vagaries of account takeover. And you saw BetMGM and DraftKings all announced various breaches. In the case of the latter two, that was just in the second half of December. So they're obviously trying to cut account takeover. But on the other, I think the really big agenda is responsible gaming. And as you see such a huge value of marketing dollars being poured into this market, it feels like the need for responsible gaming is only going to grow. Yeah. And you cannot, even in the presence of a kind of national database of self-excluding, which isn't going to happen anytime soon, But even with that, given the lengths that self-excluding gamers then go to actually log into their gaming account, you cannot do responsible gaming without understanding, the true ID of the user, their device, and the app that they're trying to log into. You need to triangulate those three. So this is a clear trend. It's going to be here for 12, 24 months, and those are the reasons why.
And when it comes to integrating multi-factor authentication into the kind of their operations, iGaming and sports betting businesses, what will the impact be on revenues? Because surely there will be one.
No question. Look, I would say this, that people need to understand that what we see as the legislators is that they're not anti the operators. They're actually there to just ensure good practice. We haven't seen anything that actually inherently results in reduced kind of revenue potential for operators. It just requires more work on the user flow in optimizing how operators meet those regulatory requirements. And to be candid, there have been plenty of instances where that thought and homework hasn't happened. And so you've seen a kind of twofold impact, and that's really important for people to understand this. The first is that whilst you put people through a multi-factor authentication, you're essentially using conventional legacy systems. You're essentially doubling the user requirement, right? They've got a name, they've got to put in a password, and then they've got to go and get from a potentially separate device. They've got to get, certainly a separate channel. They've got to get a message, whether that's via email or SMS, a 6-digit code. They're then got to enter that code. There may be, some kind of delay in that process, but that in two things. First of all, it results in less people getting through the front gates. And secondly, most importantly, it really dents the users that have successfully gone through the front gates. It dents their kind of impulse purchase desires. Yeah. So whilst on the one side you might see, a 10% drop in login success rate, and believe me, we have seen far worse than that. On the other, that's compounded in revenue terms, because those people that do get through the front gates are just, far less keen to bet, because, whatever spontaneity or time critical trade that they wanted to put on, obvious in sportsbook, halftime bet, or cash out, whatever, that hasn't happened. So actually the revenue kind of impact has been significantly greater than 10%.
And you mentioned SMS in that answer there. How does SMS impact real-time gaming? I mean, you got to remember, I mean, it is different, as you said at the beginning, it is different when you're registering and you're kind of having to potentially show your passport or dig out your driving license. This is kind of recurring. So how does SMS authentication kind of impact real-time gaming? Is that something that you prefer to stray away from?
Well, look, without a doubt, SMS should never be used for carrying secure one-time codes, because it's an unencrypted, open channel, easily open to SIM swap fraud, easily spotted from just an over-the-shoulder or with a locked device. Even you can find the one-time code. It is far from secure, and operators, in my opinion, are naive to think that both from a phishing risk point of view and just overall security, that they should not be relying on SMS. However, let's go back to basics, which is what I started with, of the user experience. People are typically sat there waiting for their SMS message, and the latency of that, it could be 2 seconds, it could be 20 seconds, could be far longer. And you have to say that SMS delivery times in the US are not great, particularly in highly built up areas, but also in rural communities. You might get delays as a result of tall buildings, or just there's a large non-urban population, and that can vary as well if people have recently changed telco operator. So sometimes the SMS takes longer to route. But look, we're talking in broad averages here, but we basically saw the New Jersey legislation roughly a 12% drop in traffic coming through, just as a result of issues around SMS. The drop in revenues was significantly higher, as I say, because people, typically bet using impulse-led desire, and friction and delay kills impulse.
Yeah. And what are the different multi-factor authentication solutions available? As we discussed earlier, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's kind of the gaming industry's got some way to go to learn more, and it will have to. So what are the benefits or pitfalls that operators should be looking out for when considering which solution to go for, and ultimately impact the customer experience? Because there is going to be an impact, but how do they mitigate that impact?
Yeah, well, I think a really important point, which whatever solution, it's really got to work on all devices. And to be fair to SMS, it is kind of universally applicable. Pretty much everyone has a means of receiving an SMS message. If it's not applicable to all devices, and some of the kind of newly developed systems only cover, say, 90-95% of devices, I would put big flags on that, because you're then going to end up with your support lines inundated with people having difficulties logging in. And we've quite a few prospects or customers complaining that their support lines were inundated, and they then were not available for customers to call in speedily and self-exclude. And the regulator, took very severe action as a result of that. So, yeah, applicability to all devices is super important. I guess really, when coming down to the different options, you've got SMS, you've got the whole idea of magic links, where you're essentially just sending someone a given individual link, but that's typically over email. And the problem is that those are often subject to spam filters. Yeah. So the users don't get those, they don't then check this. There are all kinds of issues. Then there's the new technology of passkeys. The issue with passkeys is that it isn't quite yet universal. There are still some devices for which it won't work. Plus, you are down into a 2-device setup. So the reality is that if people are logging in on their laptop, they need to have their mobile present for the most part, depending on the configuration. But yeah, we would like to think, obviously, we present a kind of universally applicable solution, but yeah, people have got to kind of figure out how best to navigate that particular challenge. It's certainly important that they don't have their customer helpline inundated.
And going forwards into the rest of the year, where can kind of our listeners find you at gaming industry events and exhibitions? Will you be attending ICE London in a couple of weeks? Are there any other events you plan on going to? Do you plan on taking a stand, or is it something that maybe people should get in contact with you directly if they wanted to chat to you?
Well, very kind of you to think about that. ICE, and it's the kind of annual gaming pageant, really. So, keen to meet people there. And I know that we're taking stands in the Canadian Gaming Summit and the SBC North America shows. Obviously, those have the higher concentration of US attendees, and no doubt will be at some of the events such as G2E later in the year. And yeah, look, I mean, I would like to think as well that we could advise people through some of the maze. So very happy to provide any guidance if that's help.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rob. I really enjoyed having you on today.
Great. Very grateful for the time. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.